I wanted to publish a game on Steam, and I already had a prototype. All I needed to do to create my game was to implement a small set of features.
Good.
Luckily, I stumbled across a YouTube video and realized that I had to make something simpler. So I had to restart from scratch. The arcade genre is one of the simplest, and after a bit of hacking I had a prototype. You play as the blue ball, which you control with your mouse cursor. Your goal is to avoid the enemies while trying to collect points. If you touch anything, you die. I let my niece and nephew try the game, and they got immediately addicted. Then they realized they could break the game by pausing and moving the cursor. But besides that, it felt like we struck gold. Now the only thing left to do was drawing the rest of the owl. I overhauled the look of the game and added a setting and credit page. I wanted to have a slight 80s vibe to it, so I went with a lot of purples and bright pinks. And then to make the gameplay stand out, I used contrasting colors. I added a bunch of particle effects to make it look more dynamic. Enemies radiate, players are followed by a trail, points explode and sparks fly when there is a collision. I used the excellent Bevy library to make my effects. Oh, I think I forgot to tell you. I'm using Rust and Bevy as my game engine. The teleportation bug had to be fixed. I realized that the mouse can move very far during a frame, so I added a shape that finds collisions on the entire line between the current frame and the last frame. Then I add a bit of code that moves your mouse when you unpause the game, so you don't accidentally die. To give the players some more agency, I gave them a push ability. The initial implementation was very simple. To know if the enemy intersects the push, since both are circles, the closest point between the two is always on a straight line between their centers. So if the distance to the closest point is smaller than the radius, it is inside. It is easily computed with this formula. I then wanted to extend the ability to push to enemies of any shape. This required a complete rewrite, since I couldn't use the circle trick anymore. Instead, I went for a raycast approach, where during a push, I shoot rays around the player and register which entities they hit and at what location and angle. Now, when I had a system for pushing stuff, I wanted to add exploding enemies, which was easily achieved. But there was a giant problem. It was impossible to see which enemies could explode and which could not. So I created a custom shading material based on Voronoi noise. You start by creating a square grid and randomly picking a cell center in each square. Then you group every point to the closest cell center, which gives you this structure. If you compute both the closest and the second closest points, you can write a function that approximates the outline of each cell. If you want a full explanation on how those outlines are calculated, I recommend this blog post. Next, we remove a percentage of the cells by adding together the coordinates of the closest point and taking the fractional part. The fractional part will always be a number between 0 and 1 and will be roughly uniformly distributed, so we can use it as a random number. Lastly, we use the correct colors. We've now created a shader that let us show how close an enemy is about to explode. If you want to dig through the shaded code, I've included a link in the description. I then added two other enemy types, one that can track you and follow you, and another one that has infinite mass and can't be pushed around. However, you have to be a bit careful, since this runs the risk of an enemy getting trapped between two massive objects, making the physics go bananas, shooting away in a random direction. I used it to create this Flappy Birds-like level, as well as this other level where you have to quickly get to a specific part of the screen. To control the gameplay, I created an abstraction I call the Orchestrator. It is a simple wrapper around a vector of faces. as well as the current phase stage. It allows me to define how enemies are spawned, how many points will be spawned every second, and so on. It is extremely flexible. On every frame it runs an update function that picks the first phase. If we're in the startup stage, it will run the corresponding method on the phase, setting up resources for later use. When the startup stage is completed, it will move on to the update stage, where the main logic resides. Here it might, for example, spawn enemies. When the update stage is completed, we move on to the cleanup stage, where we remove any leftover resources, and when it is completed, the phase is removed and we reset to the startup phase and run the entire procedure again. I then created a nice builder API for creating phases. Here you can see the code for level 1. The level is constructed from many smaller phases that are combined into one larger. All these phases run in parallel. This allows me to separate the code that spawns points from the code that spawns enemies, so I can reuse the point spawning code on each level, while I have different code for spawning enemies. All I had left to do was create a Steam page and then I will be done. Threw together a page and got rejected because of a minor error, but then I got approved. So if you want to check out Glow, you find the link in the description. It's available on Windows, Linux and Mac. The only requirement is that you have a mouse. If not, see you in the next video.